Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this critical conversation about wildfire resilience and the future of our communities. I'm Andre Perry, Senior Fellow and the Director for the Center for Community Uplift at the Brookings Institution, where climate resilience is more than an environmental imperative. It's fundamental to our mission of advancing economic mobility and well-being across race and place. When wildfires tear through neighborhoods, they just don't consume homes and landscapes. They consume dreams, generational wealth, and the very foundations of community progress we've worked so hard to build. Climate impacts, like wildfires, have become one of the most formidable barriers to affordable housing and economic opportunity. Families who have scraped together resources for home ownership can lose everything in a matter of hours. Communities that have invested decades of building local businesses, schools, and social networks watch them vanish up in smoke. And too often, it's our most vulnerable neighbors, those with the fewest resources to rebuild, who bear the heaviest burden. But here's what we know. Wildfire resilience isn't just about surviving the next fire. It's about community-level security that requires us to think structurally, addressing vulnerabilities before disaster strikes and building back stronger when it does. This demands solutions that don't just protect individual properties, but uplift entire neighborhoods and regions. The innovations we'll discuss today, from early detection systems to fire-adapted community design, represent more than technological advancement. They represent an opportunity to rally around our shared commitment to safe, thriving communities. When we invest in wildfire resilience, we support the community assets that strengthen neighborhoods, affordable housing that remains affordable, local businesses that can withstand and respond to storms and tragedies, and social networks that unite us in both crisis and in celebration. Solutions should join us, not divide us. They should advance what communities already have: their knowledge, their connections, their determination, while providing the structural support that transforms vulnerability into strength. Today's conversation will explore how we align innovation with well-being, how we make resilience accessible to all communities, and how we ensure that our response to wildfire threats builds up communities rather than leave them behind. For our online viewers, please submit your questions via email to events@brookings.edu. That's events@brookings.edu. Your voices and perspectives are essential to this dialogue. Let us begin this important work together. At this time, I'd like to bring up my colleague and friend, Dr. Stuart Yasgur, President of Economic Architecture. You can give him a round of applause.
Thank you, Andre. Hello, everyone. My name is Stuart Yasgur. I lead Economic Architecture, and I'd like to thank you all for joining us today. Whether you're with us in person or you're joining us online, we're glad that you're here. This is the second event in a series of monthly talks presented by the Brookings Institution and Economic Architecture that focuses on creating safe, healthy, and resilient homes. Today, we're looking forward to a fascinating conversation about creating resilience in the face of wildfires. We all know that wildfires are becoming more frequent and severe every year. According to analysis by UCLA, the Eaton and Palisade fires earlier this year led to the displacement of over 180,000 people and the loss of 16,000 structures. Total property and capital losses from those fires could range from $76 to $131 billion. As of July 17th, there have been over 40,000 fires this year in the United States, and together they burned over 2 million acres. Given the threat that wildfires pose, there is a natural tendency to want to reduce or eliminate them. And while there is urgency to reduce the extreme fires and fires that are caused by human activity, experience also shows us that ambitious efforts to suppress fires in the short term can actually make extreme fires more likely in the long term because it increases the amount of available fuel. We also know that fire plays a critical role in creating healthy ecosystems. Taking all this together, it means that fire, at some substantial level, is here to stay. It's an enduring part of our landscape. Recognizing this helps us frame the important questions to ask. We need to ask how we reduce the risks that wildfires pose to people, communities, and property. How do we become more resilient? And this prompts a series of subsidiary questions. How do we reduce the likelihood of extreme fires? How do we identify fires early enough to reduce the risks they pose? How do we stop fires from breaching the WUI, the wildland and urban interface? How do we harden homes, infrastructure, and critical systems? And how do we enable communities to work together to become resilient? It's worth pointing out that finding productive answers to these questions is complicated by other decisions that we're making collectively as a society. Of course, this is true at the macro level. For example, any actions we take which contribute to climate change can directly contribute to the increased frequency of extreme fires. It's also true on a more micro level. For example, we are continually increasing risk by locating a growing number of homes close to wildlands that they are themselves susceptible to wildfires. When we recognize the broad range of different ways that our choices increase risk from fire, it helps us see how complicated it will be to become wildfire resilient. It's not enough to deal with the phenomena of fire. To reduce risk, we need to influence an enormous number of individual and collective decisions. And if we're going to do this at large scale, at a scale that rises to the magnitude of the problem, then it's going to require structural change. Structural change that uses a broad range of different tools, from policy to planning to regulation, technology and market-based innovations. One of the reasons why I'm excited about the conversation today is we'll be hearing from people with three very different perspectives on how we can bring about the kinds of change we need to reduce the risk of fire from large scale. And with that, I'd like to invite Manon Donahue, fellow at the Brookings Institution, to join us and share some opening remarks. Manon, please come on up.
Hello, everybody. My name is Manon Donahue, and I'm a fellow at the Center for Community Uplifts at the Brookings Institution. I want to start by thanking you all for coming in today to discuss this important topic together. Today, we're talking about wildfires. And as the researcher on the stage, I have the unfortunate, sobering job of explaining some of the risks that wildfires present so that our panelists may have the better job of coming up on stage and talking about some of the inspiring stories that they've witnessed throughout their own tenures in their careers. Today, it's clear that a growing number of communities across the US are newly threatened by wildfires in a way that they weren't even 20 years ago, due in part to the effects of climate change that have brought drier conditions, creating more fuel for fires. Wildfire season in the Western US is about 9 days longer on average than it was in the 1980s. It also peaks earlier in July rather than in August. To some in the room, that may sound like a small difference, but it has an outsized impact. In 2024, for example, there were a total of 64,897 wildfires that burnt close to a combined 9 million acres. That's about 3 times more than the annual average between the 1980s and 2000s. For more visual thinkers, today we're in the DMV. That's the total areas of Maryland and DC combined. Now, this is actually despite the fact that the number of fires started, say by lightning or by arson, has actually decreased. So while less fires are occurring annually than in the past, the fires that are occurring are actually having a bigger impact. Now, not only are wildfires changing in duration, changing in intensity, but because of building and migration patterns, a growing number of people and structures are also more exposed than they were in the past. One particular area, you already heard Stuart talk about it, is the wildland-urban interface, the WUI. I'll say that again, the WUI. That's the area between the forests or the woods and the city, usually interspersed with properties surrounded by trees, making those homes particularly vulnerable to wildfire risk. Now, research by Resources for the Future shows that new homes in the WUI have grown by about 350,000 annually since 2004. But wildfires don't just cause direct loss of life and property damages. They also have other impacts. Perhaps the most obvious for people living on the East Coast, particularly common occurrence recently, is smoke inhalation. Recent research shows that wildfires cause approximately 25% of Americans' total exposure to harmful fine particulate matter, otherwise known as PM 2.5. Indirect effects like these, they can cause temporary economic shutdowns, which disrupt jobs and municipal services. It is estimated that up to 60% of the costs incurred during the 2018 California wildfires, they weren't caused by the wildfires themselves, they were caused by the economic shutdowns that came afterwards. And as recent Brookings research on the impacts of the LA fires by Joe Kane shows, increasingly severe fires constrain municipal infrastructure like water infrastructure that are also suffering from decades of decay and neglect. In other words, yes, wildfires, they are a physical hazard, but these impacts damages the homes in the WUI, the loss of economic activity, the health impacts of smoke inhalation, and the strain on infrastructures. They're problems that stem from other structural issues to do with land use and social and infrastructural policies. So in that, there is also a silver lining. The burden of these challenges can also be alleviated through structural innovations in policies and in markets. Now, I don't raise these challenges because I'm a pessimist. For me, as you may have noticed, an Australian now living and working in the US, advocating for greater wildfire resilience feels natural. I grew up in an area where wildfire preparedness was a part of life. It was taught in schools, discussed around the dinner table. It was planned for. Nevertheless, witnessing a wildfire is always shocking. And I still remember already living overseas, watching the 2019-2020 Black Summer fires that occurred on the Australian East Coast. I watched from afar as 59 million acres burns, and my own family was in the fire path, sheltering on the beach, as I watched which way the fire would move. Now, while my family was ultimately fine, it was a reminder of the swift destruction that a wildfire can cause. These are tragic and important events. And as I hand back to Stuart, I want you to keep that in mind. That is the human element. For many communities, particularly in the Western states, wildfires have always been a reality, like they are in many parts of Australia. But in a more unstable climate, they have become a frighteningly frequent one, stressing our social and our economic systems. We need to be responding in our policies and our plans, our federal and state investments in preparedness and resilience to minimize the risks that wildfires pose to people and communities. And I look forward to hearing our panelists speak on just that. So now I want to hand back to Stuart, our moderator, who's going to introduce the panelists and start the session. So thank you all for coming.
Thank you, Manon. So please join me in welcoming our panelists. With us today is Dr. Lori Moore-Merrill, Lori is a leader in public safety, policy development, and emergency response innovation. Lori has served at the highest levels of government, including as the former U.S. Fire Administrator from 2021 to 2025, and has a career spanning both federal government and international nonprofit roles. Lori works to reduce risks in communities and improve the safety and well-being of first responders and firefighters. Welcome, Lori. Frank Frevault has served since 1979 with local, state, and federal fire agencies in roles from firefighter to fire chief. Frank is retired from fire agencies, and currently he serves as director of the Wildland Urban Interface Fire Institute at Cal Poly San Luis Obispo, and as subject matter expert for the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation Wildfire Advisory Council. Welcome, Frank. And Peter Ambler is the vice president of global government affairs at Pano AI, which uses high-resolution cameras, artificial intelligence, and computer vision to detect wildfires and provide details to emergency responders. Peter leads efforts to educate and partner with state and local governments, federal agencies, Congress, regulators, and policymakers around the world. Welcome, Peter. Lori, I'd like to start with a question for you. There has been a strong public sentiment that we need a different response model. But you have pointed out that even with 1,000 more firefighters on some of these recent fires, outcomes wouldn't have been materially that different because the underlying conditions were so specific and extreme. So the real issue is how do we reduce risk, not just scale response. Can you help us understand this from a macro perspective at the national level? And what are the systemic changes that we need if we want different outcomes?
Absolutely. Thank you for the question. So, even with the LA fires, and that seems to be the most prominent in people's minds, around communities. The focus initially was on the response. Everybody wanted to know, why weren't the firefighters coming to their street? Why did we run out of water? All of these things that really talked exclusively about the response. Why did the fire spread when they were working over 9,000 firefighters on this fire? So it was a monumental response from the entirety of Southern California, plus states, plus feds. And so it wasn't about the response. It was that the fires have changed. And you heard Manon say that at the very beginning. What we're dealing with and the fires that we're dealing with today, the scope and scale have substantially changed. So the game has changed. Our fire departments are, in fact, prepared to respond to large-scale fires, but not like this. These are literally unwinnable fights. Firefighters don't like that. They like to win. They like to extinguish a fire, to protect people. But these fires, when you have an ignition and a fuel load like we had with LA, and I'll use that continued as the example, not only did it start in some vegetation, but after the first structure was ignited, then we're off to the races, so to speak, because it's a different fuel load. And once that fuel load begins to spray embers carried by 100-mile-an-hour winds, and other structures are ignited, whether it's by radiant heat or by embers that are being cast, large embers, not charcoal size, but large-scale embers cast 3 miles away and starting other fires in other structures. Our fuel load is massive. So was there vegetation involved? Absolutely. But the structure of fuel is different, and it burns hotter and more intensely than just a vegetative fire. And so we have to understand that any of the variables that could have changed the outcome of the LA fires were not in the response. They were before there was ever an ignition. And if we can't understand that we must change our built environment, we must change the materials with which we build, we must retrofit those that are not fire resistant, and we must change our combustibles that we keep around our homes. And so it's a responsibility of everyone, every homeowner, not just the firefighters in the response.
Yeah, thank you. I think that gives a really clear picture of what we're starting to deal with. Frank, maybe we can go down to a different level. Can you help us understand what life and risk look like in WUI communities, these communities that are at that wildland-urban interface? And why has this been such a focal point for fire strategy?
As always, great questions. As far as life and property risk in the wildland-urban interface, I know the first time I heard it, WUI sounded like some kind of a ride you were on, but within the WUI, I really break it down into two areas. From the life safety standpoint, unfortunately, but not new, we know that generally are very young, are very old, are people with pre-existing physical limitations or illnesses, and portions of the community that have lower socioeconomic class. Combined, there's less resource capability physically and less resource capability in terms of especially preparation and the ability to evacuate in certain settings. So the first thing when we look at the top priority in WUI communities is the life risk. And so the local officials that are preparing for that's information they need to be really intimately familiar with, and how you prepare for those events. From the property perspective, I love the way, Dr. Laura, you said we have to just keep rethinking this. It's going to be really helpful if we can step back a little bit emotionally, looking at that house we worked so hard for, and think of it as fuel. The conditions, which were just very eloquently described, is a system of fuels burning. Some are natural vegetation, some are man-made. But these burn at a system during these conflagration conditions. We may have a chance to discuss that later. And so it has to be mitigated as a system. As the opening comment said, we have to look at this systemically. This is not a standard issue structure fire. It's not a standard issue vegetation fire. We're very, very good, and you're right, we hate losing. But I can tell you, once we get past 2 or 3 structures, I never in my career have had the ability to change that outcome. And so how we look at life risk and property risk, the focus needs to be before the incident. If we're waiting till after, even if we know the right things to do after, you all know that agenda space gets competitive with other needs. And so we really need to think before the incident how we're going to change outcomes on the day of. And unfortunately, the things that are contributing to WUI conflagrations, not across all fuel types, but a number, unintentional consequences of really solid firefighting for over 100 years. In some places, we have too much fuel. We continue, as was mentioned, we're developing into fire, not just exposed landscapes, these are fire-dependent landscapes. They need a certain return interval of fire to be healthy. And we need that for aquifers and all kinds of other benefits. And I am no climate scientist, but the portion of climate science that made the most sense to me as a responder is this idea of dryness of the air, vapor pressure deficit. Essentially, if you think of the atmosphere as a big sponge, the sponge has gotten bigger. And so that tends to make the differential between what you can hold in suspension versus what used to be in the soil and the vegetation, that equilibrium has shifted. And so, again, to come back to Dr. Lori, she said it so well, this is a new game. That, to me, is the single biggest change. And none of those 3 things I mentioned will self-stabilize. So we have got to both build better and smarter in the future to manage that life and property risk I mentioned, but we have to retrofit the existing system. I know you want to say homes and communities, and I agree with you. We need to retrofit and mitigate the existing system of fuels that we call home.
Yeah, and I do think that it's an adjustment for people as we're all living with wildfire being more prevalent, to start thinking about things like our homes and our communities as fuel and how this connects to fire systemically. Peter, Pano AI is clearly a breakthrough technology, but it's more than technology. It's really kind of enabling behavior change and enabling coordination across agencies and regions. Can you help us understand it kind of concretely, how this technology is being used as a catalyst for structural change?
Absolutely. I think one thing I want to do today is, talk about the utility of Pano and rapid detection. I want to sort of evangelize for how technology in general is starting to step up beyond my company and be a big piece of the response to the increasing threat of catastrophic wildfire. And I also want to recognize that it's only a part of the response, right? The explosion of technology that's occurred over just the past several years, I think, is something that is able to change facts on the ground and contribute to our response. But its real utility is serving our firefighters, our agencies, and the broader infrastructure that has existed and is, building up in order to, combat this threat. In terms of what Pano AI itself does, is we're a rapid detection solution. So if you think about in a legacy approach to fire detection, it relies on 911 phone calls. Phone call goes into dispatch from a hiker, a motorist, a rancher. We see evidence of a fire, a large plume of smoke. At that point, it could well have already grown quite large. Well, where are you, ma'am? Where are you, sir? I mean, I've seen the 911 transcripts like north of Phoenix. This is not like actionable, useful information for a firefighter. So what do? Oftentimes you're putting people into a truck, you're driving around until you find the fire. Once you find the fire, you mount a lookout, you get the visual intelligence you need. And too often, too much time is elapsing between when a fire is detected and you have detection notification, when you have location, and when you have visual situational awareness, which allows you to muster an operational response and make strategic decisions about how you're going to treat the fire. what we at Pano do is we collapse all of that into just a few minutes, right? In just a few minutes, we're providing the detection from our mounted ultra high resolution cameras. We're triangulating the fire, giving you precise lat long for where that fire is. And then we're giving you not just the visual situation awareness, but the map layers, the weather layers, key things that the firefighting community needs to be able to go in. And the case studies that we get are just absolutely inspirational. And as fire season picks up and the threat grows, they sort of roll in more rapidly. I'll use one as an example, which is something called the Bear Creek Fire in Douglas County, Colorado. Colorado is the state where we are most densely deployed. We have we had 2 cameras from 2 different customers, which speaks to the sort of collaborative multi-stakeholder element of this, detect a fire just minutes after smoke is visible, which those alerts go directly to a variety of stakeholders. So multiple fire agencies all at once, they pull it up, and within 20 minutes they're able to use their heli-tac capability to start putting water on the fire. While this is a red flag day, a fire that started in a remote canyon, 2 teams of elite firefighters hike in. It takes them an hour and a half, and they battle the blaze for 6, 7, 8 hours. And by the end of the day, it's been suppressed at under 3 acres. And just extraordinary example of success in a fire that could have easily been one that could have grown beyond that small containment and been something that various agencies were trying to contain for days, weeks, maybe even longer. And what we do is illustrative of a broader profusion of technology in this sector. Our co-founders, our founders, Sonia Kastner and Arvind Satyam, Sonia, our CEO, from Nest, Arvind from Cisco, where they, think about Pano as like Nest for the forest, right? Think about, and Arvind sort of outfitted whole cities to sort of be interconnected and smart. They started in Pano in 2020 at a time when there were roughly 10 like fire tech startups, and most of you have probably never heard the term fire tech before, but we are a fire tech company. Today, several years later, there are well over 500. Right? We just established the Alliance for Fire Tech Innovation, the first ever industry trade group dedicated to the fire tech for the fire tech industry. I can stop there, and I'm happy to sort of talk about how all these technologies can work together to provide what's fundamentally like a new information layer for the folks on the ground, the firefighters, the agencies, the communities that are dealing with this problem every day.
That's great. And it does start to give a kind of really concrete sense of how technology, digital technology is being used to really make a difference. And it's not so much just about the shiny new widget. It's really changing how people are working together in ways that wouldn't have been possible without it. So maybe for all 3 of you, can we kind of, now that we're starting to see the picture, where do you see the biggest opportunities in the 3 to 6 months ahead to really drive change? Because this, fires are happening now as we speak. Where are those opportunities, and where are the real opportunities for innovation?
Wow. Well, I'll jump in. I think we have real opportunities for fuels mitigation, right? We have to talk about the fact that there are different landscapes. And I think everybody needs to understand that when we say wildfire, for years we've talked about wildland fire. You've heard that terminology. It's always wildland fire. Well, wildland is a place. That's a location. We have the interface that you've talked about, the wildland urban interface. That's a place. And then, of course, communities. That's a place. These are all 3 different landscapes in which you can experience wildfire. So I want to be very clear about that. And we need to operate in all of them just a little bit differently. Because if we say fuels mitigation, what does that look like in each of those landscapes? So I think we can begin to help people understand what does that mean in the forested areas, the wildland, because there is technology that can be leveraged there. We need fuels reduction. We can leverage fire there. You've heard fighting fire with fire, and I know Frank is going to double down on that, but we have to do that in the wildland space because we need fuels reduction. In the WUI, it's different. We're going to mitigate, and we certainly want defensible space. And if you've ever heard that term, defensible space, it's about giving firefighters an area that they can come in and defend your home and defend long enough to evacuate you if they need to. So understand what these terms mean is really important. And I think that we have to focus in all of these areas. And then, of course, the urban conflagration that we've talked about, that's another term. Conflagration, you probably haven't heard that for 100 years. The Great Chicago Fire, 100, right? But this is structure-to-structure fire spread. So I think we first have to recognize that. And then what can we do in each of these areas? Tech is going to play a huge part. We are going to have tech in all of these areas. You've just heard about Pano and some of their detection systems, but there's tech that we can leverage in the pre. There is technology called BurnBot. If you want to see something that can do fuels mitigation 10 times what humans can do, it's amazing. Then we've got other detections. There are AI sniffing sensors. There are cameras. There's satellite, Earth orbit, all of our Earth observation. And then, of course, in the during, we've got suppression capability. Everything from ballistic type spot fire missiles to swarms of drones. All of these tools that will become tools for firefighters to use, not to be other than firefighters. So there's a lot of room for technology. Last thing I'll hit on this is understanding the fire service. We have an executive order that has come down from the Trump administration around the wildfire space. And part of that executive order has ordered that the federal resources for response be combined, consolidated into one. So that seems to be moving, not a bad move, because we need to understand what resources we have and understand what the scope and scale of their capabilities are, which are not what everybody thinks they are, because the feds don't respond to every wildfire. We need to understand local and state capabilities, where you've got about 12,000 federal firefighters, you've got 1.4 million state and local. That's who responds to the initial attack on these fires. And so we need to make sure that we have coordination and understanding at all levels of government of who's coming, who's doing the fuels mitigation, who's coming if there is an ignition, and who's going to get you out in that time frame. So these are things that are front of mind for me.
I think that's great. And then, Frank, I want to hear your kind of follow-up to it. But, you know, I think you're just helping people recognize just the magnitude of complexity here. You know, when we think about that number of firefighters, different agencies, and the coordination and everything that has to go on. Yes. Frank, if you could follow up on that, can you help make it a little bit more concrete for folks as we talk about fuel mitigation? Because, you know, you're embedded in this, but for many people, they're still thinking about homes and houses and shrubbery and trees and et cetera. But can you help us be a little concrete about it for us?
Yes, it's we're all learning new language and new terms and the relationship between those terms. So again, as I said earlier, if we start to think of our communities as a system of fuels, at Cal Poly, the way we're approaching this is to articulate in what we call 3 fire pathways. So there's a vegetation to vegetation fire pathway. Fire propagates through the vegetation. That's what you think of as a wildfire. Up to about a half mile outside of a community. That's one pathway. The next one, think of it like a donut. About 100 feet out into the vegetative landscape that'll carry fire, and about 2, maybe 3 layers of structures inside the community. And that donut is another fire pathway, vegetation to structure. We weren't really imaginative on this. But that is another place where we can disrupt heat transfer. And then the last one is structure to structure. By the time we get into that conflagration, this has fully transformed itself from an initial wildfire, vegetation to vegetation. We're starting to transition to a real disaster when multiple embers ignite multiple structures simultaneously. That's what overwhelms the first response of all the local responders. And you have to go with what's in your back pocket. You don't, most of the losses are done in about 12 hours. And so you can't rely on same-day fire service from around the state or the country. You have really got to make it, your impact soon. And so when we talk about fuels mitigation, it's the whole thing. We believe that that last half to a quarter mile and final approach, the embers are going to go for miles, as you've heard. But there's things you can do to drop intensity, maybe even drop speed a little bit, and keep connective fuels on the ground from adding more ways to transfer heat from the vegetation to the structures. On the structures themselves, it's really about two things you're trying to do. One is don't give a nice, happy place for an ember to land, and they're going to come by the millions. And so try to keep the ember salt from igniting the structure. The second piece is radiant heat. Once you start to get structures burning, especially when they're close, 50 to 30 feet, you start to get down in that range, you now have enough continuity and density under those high wind conditions, and you need a different kind of mitigation there than just the ember protection. So you have to do the whole thing. This is not a smorgasbord where you can sort of pick the things you want to do, leave the other ones there, because the fire will always find the weakest link. We have to mitigate those fuels as a group. 3 to 6 months?
Yes.
Whew. I mean, what I would shortcut to is adoption, right? Our message, whether it's Pano, whether it's any number of other advanced technologies that are being mobilized to have an impact in the wildfire space, is that we have gone to market oftentimes with sort of more wealthy localities and also frequently large electric utilities, the investor-owned utilities. And that those types of entities have really catalyzed the growth, the creation and the growth of the fire tech industry. That's how you move from 5, 10 startups to an industry that boasts 5, 6, 700 companies trying to make an impact here. But to have like a pervasive and also an equitable impact, we have to move beyond those types of stakeholders and those customers and see the public sector adopt. And we have to start, breaking down the budgetary, the policy, the cultural, the normative barriers that have existed for a long time to technology adoption. I don't think anyone's surprised that, higher net worth communities or the private sector are the first to adopt. That's fine. Maybe that's their role. But what we need to see accelerate rapidly is public sector adoption. We need to start thinking of, Lori did a fantastic job of going over some of the places where technology has the potential to have a real impact, right? When you talk about community level improvements, a company like Fireside is making a huge impact, helping homeowners and communities, make themselves more fire safe. You have a company like Vibrant Planet that is, helping fire agencies and land managers predict where fire is going to start, where it's going to be most intense. You have detection from companies like ours. You have satellites that can monitor and map larger fires. And then you've got, companies like TechnoSilva, for example, does post-ignition prediction. What's a fire going to do once it starts? Excuse me. And, we all in various different ways encounter, similar problems where we are ready. It's sort of like a put me in coach type of moment, right? But, because, like the federal government, many state governments are so labyrinthine and challenged by this growing threat, it's hard to sort of press the adopt button. But I think we just need to start going. We need to start adopting.
And so if you want to jump in, Frank?
Just real quick, and then I failed to answer your 3 to 6 months when I was talking about the fuels piece. 2 items would be mitigation alignment. We have right now nationally probably about 10 mitigation packages that different organization agencies have put forward. They all have standing in different places. The one that I point to the most regularly and strongly is the IBHS Wildfire Prepared Home Standard. The second thing is something we're calling a WUI data commons, because the only way to populate, especially modeling, post-fire recovery, all those mitigations that we're doing, both on the responder side for better intel for a place you've never been at 2 a.m., and also post-fire analysis. So those would be my two for the next 3 to 6 months.
And I have to say something on the adopt, please, because I love Peter using the word adopt, and I absolutely concur, but I want to expand that to adopting building codes. Because right now, we even have communities where we say they are adopted, but we still have builders that are not building the code, and they're not enforced. So we can't just adopt when we come to a building code. We've got to implement and enforce, and I think that's something that's got to change in the next 3 to 6 months.
I think that's a great point. And maybe just to follow up on that, because we talked about IBHS and the standards. One is I don't know if people, even in California, even very close to communities that were just affected by fire, the average homeowner whose responsibility it is in many instances may not really know what those codes are, what they require, and also how much they help. And also the fact that, whether or not you're safer depends on what your neighbors do and what your community does. Can you help us understand a little bit about what these standards are, how they're helping, and how important they are to be put in place as we continue to see this risk adapt?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that I think we talk about codes and standards post-disaster, right? That's when we focus on them. After something really bad like LA happens, or Lahaina, or the Marshall Fire in 2021, right? We can just go on and on of communities that have been burned in the last 3 to 4 years. And that's when we talk about building codes. We have to get in front of the conversation post-disaster. It needs to be in community planning. And the unfortunate part, and Frank sort of hit on this, we are placing communities right in the path of fire. We are literally have communities that are clearing, trees in fire-prone lands that have burned for hundreds of years to perpetuate the forest and all of those wonderful things. But just because you clear the trees and now put homes there does not make that geography any less fire prone. And that's where we're losing our understanding. And then you have builders community that want to build quickly, and they will relax building codes just to do the quick build or the less expensive, they claim, for building codes. And that's when we get into trouble. Even communities that are post-disaster, not the new communities, post-disaster communities, we're seeing that because there is an urgency to get people back in their homes. We understand that. But if you build back less than the code, less than the ICC, WUI code, the Wildland Urban Interface Code, or the IBHS fortified codes, it's gonna burn again. This is not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. And so these are conversations that have to be very front of mind with community planners.
I'd add one thing that can happen right now and does happen every fire season, even though, as we all know, fire season is no longer confined to what was traditionally considered fire season, and that's organizing. That's building political capital. I'm not talking about like electoral politics. I'm not talking about partisanship here, because this is an issue that I've noticed for the most part unites our country across partisan divisions. But we need real people to put the pressure on policymakers to take action, to prioritize this. And that means taking a bit of a longer view. We cannot wait till smoke is hanging thickly in the air. We cannot wait till we can literally see the flames from our homes. We need, Americans of all stripes to organize. There's an organization that we work closely with that's partnered with industry called Mega Fire Action that's done a fantastic job building the bridge between the concern that exists among regular people at the community level around the threat of catastrophic wildfire and policymakers. And that's that's social capital that we need to continue to develop and do so, make it louder, make it more demanding, because that's when things are going to happen bigger, happen faster.
I think that's great. And to Lori, to follow on one of your points is, so I think, when you talk about building codes, it's not the topic of conversation that necessarily draws the most attention or enthusiasm. I think it can be a pretty dry topic, but I think because of that, sometimes we are putting together very different things under discussion of building codes and the time. Then there's some frustration with the time that building codes impose on the building process. But unfortunately, one of the things that seems to be happening is we might be throwing out or have a willingness to throw out codes that are really there to protect community, people, property, just for expediency, as opposed to thinking about, some of these other areas where building codes could potentially be changed and modified.
I think insurance has got a role in this. Sorry, Frank, I know you want to. Insurance has got a role here because I think what we're starting to see is that if you don't build a code, you're not getting insurance. That's it, full stop. And so we have a lever that can be pulled here, and I'm hoping that the insurers will continue to step into this space, not walk away. That's important, that the insurers not walk away from the wildfire space, that they help use the leverage they have to cause people to build in a fire-resistant manner, to be fire-adapted, and not just your home. It has to be the neighborhoods, and that's some of the work that IBHS has done. It's not just one home. It's fire-resistant neighborhoods, because that's the only way you're getting insurance. You see, in hurricanes or floods or, storm insurance, you can get it for your home. Doesn't matter what your neighbors do. For wildfire, for fire insurance, if your neighbors are not also fire resistant or fire adapted, you're not getting insurance. And so these are the different levers that we really need the insurance agencies to step into and uphold these building codes and cause them to be. Otherwise, the assets that we all want homes and homes to be assets, they become the peril. And now you have no assets. And so this is a conversation that's difficult, but necessary.
Well, to cue up a comment you made earlier that you're working on solutions, right? You've heard things today that could make you feel a little depressed, a little overwhelmed. It certainly qualifies as a wicked problem. But I'd like to point to two examples. Actually, this room is a good one. Back in the late 60s, early 70s, we were suffering from an unacceptable level of life and property loss due to interior structure fires. There was a federal commission formed. They generated something called America Burning. And in the time from roughly the 80s, takes a while for that to get printed and put in, from the 80s till I looked up the inverse data the other day on up to 2019 or 20, fire service call volume in the U.S. had more than tripled. The percentage of those calls being residential structure fires had gone from about 27% down to about 1% when you look at residential structure fires. Now that took decades. Something very similar if you look up the Insurance Institute for Highway Safety. Sounds a lot like IBHS. Back in 1959, they were having unacceptable levels of loss. They invested in research. And as you walk through that timeline, the same things we're hearing now about it's difficult to build homes properly and safely. We heard that about airbags and seatbelts and bumpers and crumple zones. But those have now become a sales feature. Those are things that we expect to have. So we can do this, but there's no quick fix. There will be tremendous advancements we can get from technology that will push us forward. We can get policy alignment. Sometimes it's easier than others. But what we really need to realize is that there are no easy paths forward. We need to get that off the agenda. There is only hard forward. A colleague of mine, Robert Edson, he likes to say, pick your hard. All the easy things have been done. All we have left are hard things. But we can point to examples where commitment, research, linking that with codes and practices, and working hard on the economics, and especially down at the kitchen room table economics, we can do this. We've done it before. We've done it with air quality, air basins that were deemed unredeemable. We've fixed pension systems this way. So we can do this, but we just have to commit. There's no easy path forward. It's going to take a long time, and it is going to be hard. We don't want to skip those.
No, I think that's right. I would also mention, though, that, what you're naming is a frontier for innovation, right? Right. And because if we take the measures we need to reduce the risk, it can reduce the costs for things like insurance, for home ownership over long periods of time. So these, in some ways, the fact that this is a multifaceted problem also admits to solutions and innovations that may actually create kind of knock-on benefit effects.
That's called resilience. Right? That's building resilience so that when these fires occur, and they are going to occur, that they hit the built environment and they stop because there's nothing to burn, right? It's reduced. And so our impact of loss is greatly lessened. That's resilience.
And just to connect that dot, It also decreased costs for homeowners, right? Which, is another major issue that all homeowners are facing. So I know time is going quickly. Let's maybe lift our eyes to the horizon a little bit. So we're seeing some of the immediate opportunities, some of the opportunities, but also what's the vision? How do we start looking to the horizon? What does it look like 3 to 5 years from now when we started to move forward on some of these things?
You guys are waiting, so
I think we're going in a row.
All right, we'll do that.
That's what
we'll
I've been
do
taught
that.
here. Yeah.
3 to 5 years. I want to. My hope is that, like Frank said, we have individuals who now understand this. It is important that we understand across our nation. Well, this is a global problem, first of all, but across our nation, that this is not just the Western states. And so I think in 3 to 5 years, we're going to have that recognition one way or the other. Either you're going to realize it and we're going to start across the nation mitigating for wildfire, which means hardening our homes, the right roofing materials, building that way, retrofitting where we need to, and people understanding the threat. Or you're going to have these fires. Because post-LA, Headwaters Economics did an assessment of all of the variables from the LA fire. They looked at everything from the built environment, how close the proximity of the homes were, what the building materials were, the vegetation that was involved in the community, the drought at the time, the rains they'd had months earlier that caused the overgrowth, and then the drought, all of these factors. And they determined that there are 1,100 communities just like that across the U.S., just like LA, with the exact same propensity. And where do you think most of those are? The Southeast, not in the West. And so we have to understand that Georgia, Tennessee, Florida, North Carolina, all the way up the East Coast as well, have a propensity, and the exact same scenario can happen. So I'm hopeful that that's what we'll begin to realize, and that we have individuals who take responsibility, because as we started, there are not enough firefighters to focus on response here. There's just not enough in the nation for that. We must mitigate the variables before the response.
I think there are a few that would be good waypoints to hit. The first is that we need to figure out how to remove social barriers to implementation and maintenance to these kind of mitigations. There are some really good reasons to not like them. I'm a property owner. I can think of a few. But we have to accept what is possible and what's coming. The most devastating WUI incident ever in this country was in Wisconsin, the same day as the Great Chicago Fire, for the same reasons, the wind. Gatlinburg, Tennessee, a few years ago. You don't think of that, but we had a tremendous WUI loss there. Part of what will be a good waypoint that is starting to happen, for the first time in my career, I'm seeing economists and environmentalists sitting on the same side of the table by accident. And so really the environment has become the economy in a way we probably didn't recognize back, unless we were, in our kind of our agricultural driven economy. So I think that's going to be huge. We are going to need to have, within a few years, some real recognition of something Dr. Laurie mentioned earlier, is that we really don't know how to value the initial response. We know that most of this work has got to be done before the incident, but it can make it easy to look over what happens when you can get the right resources in the right place at the right time. They can be tremendously valuable. Our current system of response is designed to get to some place in about 8 to 10 minutes. And that's because historically has been about the time you hit this critical space on an interior structure fire, and it's also the time when if you have a medical emergency, you really start to have some irreparable damage. So our whole system is designed around this quick response. We've got to make sure we know how to invest in that asset that we've already invested in local communities, and give that the best chance along with these other mitigations. And then the last thing I would share is that I believe, and it's coming pretty quickly, it may not take 3 years, but we're starting to see financial risk contagion. Insurance is an indicator of uncertainty on how to price risk, but it is rapidly moving to realty, blending, building. I think general obligation municipal bonds will get local government's attention in the near future. Hope those things don't happen, but it seems like they are. So once we know the magnitude of what we're dealing with, I think we'll start getting more aggressive about solutions.
I'm, in my heart, like a nerd and a wonk. And, what really animates me are, solving some of the smaller problems that we encounter so that we can sort of, in this case, encourage adoption, right? And I just want to give you like a couple of examples. So you might go to a, public sector agency somewhere in this country, state or federal level, and, discuss a partnership, and the response you might get back is like, well, our technology budget is spoken for. But we have to change how we're thinking about technology, right? This is not a Microsoft Word subscription, right? These are technologies that need to be infused into every element of how agencies across the country mitigate, fight, and fight fire. Another example, at the state level, oftentimes at the federal level, you have two bigger buckets of funds. You have preparedness funding and you have suppression funding. Like oftentimes technologies like ours sort of either get sort of lost in that question because you don't fit naturally into either one, or they get put into the preparedness bucket when the suppression bucket is much larger, and if we're eligible for that, could lead to much more rapid adoption. And I think small things like that ultimately could make like a very, very big difference in how quickly public sector agencies are able to adopt. And then I would echo some of my panelists here in talking about the importance of insurance, right? We have to get to that tipping point where at a community level that these sort of technology interventions are being like accounted for in risk models, and that they're having a impact on people's ability to get insurance, and diminishing some of the upward pressure on those rates. And I think once we're at that tipping point, the adoption acceleration is just going to go through the roof.
I think those are both great points, and breaking down the silos obviously critical if we're going to get new adoption and new ways of thinking about things that cut across kind of traditional categories. And I would say that what we're seeing also on the insurance side, and maybe we're going to be having a conversation about insurance in the months ahead. There's, I think, very promising new developments and innovations there to not only create the stick part of it of exiting, but also the carrot to help the economics of this all start to work better. I'm going to ask you all to do something hard. Is that we're a couple minutes from Q&A, but there's a big question. We're in D.C. How do we think about the role of federal and state policy in really moving this forward?
What I'm hopeful is that, as I mentioned, we do have an executive order that's making some changes in the response force. What we need is some legislation or some budgetary action around the intelligence side of this. And what I mean by that is a data-driven what we've called the Environmental Intelligence Center. And I say we, there was a wildfire commission that was commissioned under the Biden administration that had 50 of our top experts across the nation from every sector around wildfire come together. And one of the prominent recommendations, there were 148 of them, but one of the prominent recommendations was around having a data, almost a fusion center. So we have the intelligence from everything from the ground, the fuels, to understanding where our response capabilities are. And I love what Frank said about matching those response capabilities and, to the risk events that they are responding to, but also looking forward and having, data from satellite images and the fuel growth, and during a fire, the span and the growth of the fire itself. All of this is information we need in one place. Right now, it's quite scattered. So I'm hopeful that at the federal level, we can establish an intelligence center that will combine all of this varied data that's all over the place right now into one place, so that we truly have intelligence around this for every aspect, the pre, the during, and the after.
I think probably the single biggest thing from a policy perspective would be whether it's federal, state, or local policy, anything that's designed to help constituents, especially related to cost, with mitigation and insurability. any legislation along those lines, in my opinion, I would strongly, strongly encourage it to have a really tight mitigation component that to qualify for that, you have to get the work done. It can be an association with the funding, but to do the funding to buy down financial pain without changing conditions on the ground will not change outcomes for what's coming. And so, again, pick your heart. There's no easy path forward along with any subsidization of insurance costs specifically. Please, please link a very, very strong mitigation component with that.
I addressed a couple points in my last answer, but I build on Lori's point, which is, if we have the fusion center, if we have, this intelligence center, the common operating picture, we have to have the inputs as well, right? So that's only going to be as good as the broader investments that we're making, not just federally, but across the country, state, local, private sector, in the technologies that are going to give you the most vivid, rich possible information layer that's going to make us, more effective, more strategic, more efficient as we deal with this threat.
That's great. And now we are at time for a Q&A session. So we have a wonderful group of folks online who have submitted questions in advance, but there's also a chance for people in the room to ask questions. If you have any questions, please be bold. Yes, great.
Can you hear me? Okay. Hi, my name is Hannah Stevens. Thank you all for your time. Just on a personal level, my family has lived in Forest Ranch, California for decades. And so this is very near and dear to my heart. I actually have two questions to kind of like meet the panel where they're at. The first is, given the unknown landscape around water usage with AI, how are you all thinking about that as you're creating these incredible tools that can help save lives? If that were scaled, say every state takes up this technology, how do we think about ways to mitigate the possible ramifications of increased water usage with AI tools? And then my second is, how do y'all think about the usage of controlled burns in terms of mitigation? It can be a really misunderstood and frankly controversial tool. And what kind of challenges do we have ahead of us to use this? Is that a tool that we think is going to be part of the future of fire mitigation, or do we have to look elsewhere? Thank you.
Yes, great questions. I'm going to see if I can get both of them with one answer. I see those as really intrinsically tied. If the work we do at the Institute is wildly successful, I see it as actually enabling a much more important objective: prescribed fire at scale. We have a deficit, an annual deficit of beneficial acres burned in a healthy ecosystem. It varies a lot by country or by parts of the country, but it's essential. I know personally from working at the local government level that will never be an acceptable long-term, large-scale policy until we can demonstrate confidence in the ability to not burn down a community, either from wildfire or prescribed fire. And I'm really worried about secondary impacts on aquifers if we don't do that. So we need to do those things together.
Excellent question. On this second one, I think prescribed fire, vitally important to put fire in the ground, mitigate risk, and the situational awareness that companies like Pano bring are utilized not just for suppression when you're choosing to suppress a fire, but also to enable more effective and efficient prescribed fire. To your first question, Pano itself, from a compute standpoint, I don't know all the details, but it's sort of apples and oranges in terms of our computer vision and image ID artificial intelligence is trained on over 1 billion images, but that is nowhere close to what the sort of type of compute that the larger LLMs and others are using. So I would suggest that, this isn't the place to sort of look for, concern about the sort of broader impact of artificial intelligence when it comes to water usage and similar environmental impacts. I would say, though, that, the primary way thus far we've gone to market is with electric utilities, right, who are concerned about their uncapped liability and are seeking to use rapid detection to mitigate the risk associated with transmission wildfire. And there is a sort of shift that's occurring, right? Transmission, like up to just a couple years ago, was sort of thought of primarily as a something that was needed to expand so we could bring more clean energy onto the grid, right? Because you had to go out where wind farms, solar farms, et cetera, were in order to bring that electricity back onto the grid. Now it's and I know this is not where your question was going, but now the grid is being strained because of the the compute and the energy needs associated with the growth of AI, making protection of the grid even more important from a wildfire standpoint.
Great. So we have another question here.
Hi, thank you for all this. I wanted to piggyback off the question of prescribed fires. So one of the things that I've heard in this discussion is the importance of messaging, and messaging both in terms of how big of a problem this is, but also different ways that we can mitigate that. One of the things I also hear is that for future homeowners like myself, we're gonna have to pay a lot of money to try to make sure that our houses, on top of what we have to pay for to make sure our houses are safe. And in a lot of Western U.S. states, as well as Southeastern U.S., we need to start thinking about a lot of prescribed fire if possible. I really want to ask you a very targeted question, which is ask, how would you go about convincing people that it's okay, that as humans, we really hate to suffer in the short term, that all of these steps that we can take will actually be worth it in the end? Because I feel like it's always going to be an uphill battle to try to make that happen.
Wow, that's a really, really great question. The messaging and the content of the messaging has got to be different than we've ever done before, because this issue has got to break through noise. And oftentimes from disaster to disaster, you only have the window of opportunity to change people's behavior until the next disaster. And then everybody's talking about that one. And so the window of opportunity we have to exercise in order to say the right things, to get the right movement. Now, I'll tell you that I think that the LA fire in particular gave us a great opportunity to try to change the messaging and really move some human behavior, unlike other fires, unlike Lahaina, unlike all the others, because of the communities that were affected. I'll be very frank with you. There were very wealthy people who were affected in LA. And somehow that has held the window of opportunity for us to change behavior open longer than other fires. Now, whatever the dynamics of that may be, it's happening. So we have to leverage it in this moment and really double down on the messaging, but it's got to be the right messaging and perpetual. So every little variable that comes to play, and I think that is one, is part of this conversation. So there's no easy answer, but it is something that has got to maintain front of mind focus, that this is not easy. Jeanette Sutton, I don't know if you're familiar, but that's a name. If you're not, you should be. Jeanette Sutton is really leading the game on messaging around this space. She started around evacuation messaging, because if you've ever gotten an evacuation message, you know that it's, I don't know, what do you want me to do kind of scenario. And so we really have to use common language, and I think that's really helpful. So I will just throw that name out.
Great. I would add that, and we have one more question there, but I'll just, I think, as fire becomes more prevalent, we all are getting more aware and familiar with it. It's also causing us to rethink a number of different things, including, for many people, we think about wildlands as carbon sinks, right? We need the forest to grow, and we need it to be more and more active so it can store the carbon. But, unfortunately, sometimes we're overloading those natural landscapes with too much what now is becoming fuel in the language of this conversation. So it really is prompting us to think differently.
Hey, back here. Thanks for doing this. Lori, I wanted to ask you, you talked a little bit about the executive order and the U.S. Fire Agency that's under development. Seems like you think that there's some positive potential there. What about some of the other policies that have been rolled out? So, I believe it's like 5,000 people have left the Forest Service since the administration took office. Many of those held red cards. And the proposed budget would basically like zero out the state, private, tribal forestry program and other Forest Service research initiatives and grants. How do you see that impacting things moving forward? Obviously, that budget is not yet adopted, but just seeing that down in paper, that the administration, that's their policy position. What are sort of your thoughts?
I love that question. Thank you very much. The first part of that I seem positive about that parts of the executive order is a we'll see response for me. I am hopeful it's a first step. And some of the other things that we're seeing in the budget around an intelligence center, around a large amount of money for fuels mitigation and preparedness. So those are good signs. It doesn't mean they've come to fruition yet. It just means they're good signs. Some of the other things that are happening, it's like one step forward, two steps back. You're exactly right. We've had a devastating loss of federal institutional knowledge, of federal just workforce that were, boots on the ground that are very much needed right now. And that's at all aspects. It's from imagine the officer cadre and the U.S. Forest Service that has departed, or BLM that's departed. I mean, we're talking now about, folks on the ground with short time on the job in a very dangerous job. And so losing that workforce is going to be monumental. So all of these things bear watching, and we're going to have to stay really diligent about what the administration does and how this plays out. That's why you see a lot of the folks in the private and philanthropic sector really leaning in here. There's a lot of folks that are looking at funding fuels mitigation. There's a lot of folks that are, providing grants to develop more technology, to get technology to market. All of these things are happening because we are afraid of what is the real possibility that can go down here without federal support, and that extends over to FEMA as well. I'll just drop that in the chat here. We don't know what the capabilities for federal response is going to be, so state and local must double down. They must continue to train, hire, and be prepared. We also have an influx state of our grants, so we're just not sure. And I'll just speak to the AFG grants, Assistance to Firefighters grants. Those have been peer-reviewed and ready for award, but not been awarded yet because everything over $100,000 apparently has to be, approved by the Secretary of Homeland. So we can't even get grants out to the ground. So yes, it's a yes, but kind of answer for you. But thank you for that question.
If I could add a couple things on there, you'd mentioned red cards. So just for anybody that's not familiar with that, red carding is it's a system of training and verification that you're qualified at various levels out on these very complex incidents. They're really miraculous in that we bring people from all over the country in the middle of the night who've never worked before, but because they know a system, they may also work on a team that's convened, but that system itself allows us to surge resources and experience on time and on target for the best outcomes. That loss is going to be huge. I used to work in the Federal Fire Service, and you really wanted to make sure that the people giving you that direction had the right qualifications and experience. And so it's an excellent point that you brought out, and it's one that has a lot of us really looking close to that. That said, I've been at
hopeful Frank here. Go ahead.
I've been at this a while. I've watched administrations come, administrations grow. We've gone through, government shutdowns while we had planes in the air and people on the hillside. You don't just roll up your kit and leave, right? We've got to do this for our own communities. There'll be times when it's easier, times when it's harder. Think about insurance for a minute. I've got health insurance. I don't want to collect on it this afternoon. I want to maintain good health, right? The insurance is there for the unexpected thing. The goal should be survivable communities and survivable homes. The insurance is helpful to that. But don't, please, none of us, don't let us get distracted by the temporal things in politics, because this problem, as I pointed out earlier, is going to take decades. It is always a local government issue. It has state and federal consequences and benefits from state and federal level support, but it is always a local government issue. And that's where we will win or lose this in the decades to come.
Great. Well, then, looking at the clock, unfortunately, because the conversation could keep going, I have a bunch more questions to ask, but I think that's going to have to be the closing word, and maybe a fitting closing word for this. So I want to thank you all for participating in this panel. I'd like to thank you all for joining us here today. This is for the second event in the series of monthly talks hosted by the Brookings Institution in Economic Architecture that focuses on creating safe, healthy, and resilient homes. We hope to see you at our next event, which will be in September, when we'll look at structural innovations to address the risk from hurricanes 20 years after Katrina. And every week, we will also be hosting a series of one-on-one conversations with innovators really focusing on solutions that will be available wherever you listen to podcasts. So it'll be coming out later this summer. Please do keep an eye out for it at economicarchitectureproject.org. And with that, Andre, I'd like to pass the baton back to you.
Dr. Stuart Yasgur, thank you always for your partnership, and I want to thank our panelists. In particular, when you're sitting there conjuring up your remarks, you look for an analytic question or something to point on, and something that really struck me was when Dr. Lori asked us to really rethink how we look at fuel. It's not just about the vegetation around us. It includes the things like our homes and other inanimate objects, the swing sets in the yard, the empty containers. All of this is fuel. But she also, I want to say, forced us to rethink fuel in another way. How do we become the fuel that builds instead of burns, right? How do we fuel early detection systems? How do we fuel economic security? How do we fuel building codes to mitigate risk? How do we harden infrastructure and protect entire communities and not just individual homes? How do we fuel data to our communities and get data, use data to have us cooperate across place and across race? So I want to thank Dr. Lori Moore-Morell, Frank Freevault, Peter Ambler, my colleague Manon Donahue, and of course Stuart Yasgur for really being the fuel for change. And I'm Andre Perry of the Brookings Institution. Thank you for joining us today.